so much of the economy is on the right path. GDP was up 2.5% last year, and many Americans are beginning to feel more optimistic. Still, there are many challenges. Our national debt is ballooning. Social Security is facing insolvency. Our aging population and declining birth rates are posing some unique challenges, and our country's politics are arguably more polarized than ever. Our panelists are deeply immersed in these issues, and so many more factors playing into the country's fiscal stability. And our moderator, Greg Ip from the Wall Street Journal, follows them all very closely. Greg's name is certainly a familiar one with this audience. As the chief economics commentator for the Wall Street Journal, he writes about US and global developments and policy in the weekly Capital Account column and on Real-Time Economics, the journal's economics blog. From 2008 to January 2015, he was the US economics editor for The Economist based in Washington, D.C. And Greg comments regularly on television and radio. He's the author of The Little Book of Economics, How the Economy Works in the Real World, and Foolproof, Why Safety Can Be Dangerous and How Danger Makes Us Safe. When I teach Econ 1, I very frequently refer to articles that Greg has written over the years. He's been a tremendous resource for me, and I honestly could not think of a better moderator for this panel. And I'm so glad Greg and the three panelists can be with us today. So thanks for being here with us, Greg, and I think you're going to intro our three people. Sure. Yeah, great.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks very much, Mark. I've been writing about economics for 30 years, and I think that I wrote about my first fiscal crisis within a few years of starting this business. So I've written about fiscal policy and like the oncoming fiscal crisis for about 30 years, but I've never actually had that crisis happen. You know, it's always just a few years away. So it's kind of an obsession with me. But last year, I kind of felt like this was the moment. Like the budget deficit was getting larger, Treasury auctions were not going well, the long-term bond yield was shooting up to 5%, and felt like finally this was the moment. In the end, it wasn't. The bond yield came back down and people stopped talking about the debt. Well, that doesn't mean the problem has disappeared. It just means that it's like the parameters of how it comes at us still remain a little bit murky. To sort of clear the picture, I can't think of three better people to offer us some insight into the future than the folks on this panel. Phil Swagel, I've known Phil for years. He was in the White House under George W. Bush. He was later into the Treasury Department. He teaches at the University of Maryland. In the last few years, he's been director of the Congressional Budget Office, which is, if you haven't heard of it, is the most important economic institution in this country, because it's not always right, but it's always unbiased. And they provide that such important thing, which is an unbiased template that everybody else works from when they're thinking about the future of the economy and the fiscal situation. Next to him is Maya MacGuineas, another friend that I've known for many years. Maya runs the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. I like to say that when all the other budget hawks are dead, she'll be the last one standing. And she's really a journalist's dream, because not only is she incredibly smart and driven, but she's so quotable. And I want you to bring that game today, Maya. And on the far end, Bill Gale, another person I feel like I've been interviewing for years and years and years, truly one of the country's most leading and thoughtful experts and commentators on fiscal policy, all those years with the Brookings Institution. They're each going to give you a few opening remarks, then we're just going to have a great conversation, and later I'd like to hear your questions. Phil, do you want to give us a few early thoughts?
Sure. No, thanks so much. Thanks, Greg. And Mark, thanks so much for inviting me out. And I'm really glad that the budget deal got done yesterday, so I'm here today. So just thinking of the intro video about how when Stanford calls, people from Washington come. It's like, if the budget deal is done, yes. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about what's the same and what's different. And we released our latest budget and economic outlook a couple weeks ago, and so that's what I'm keying off of. And the big picture is that the part that's the same is the bad news, or the challenging or daunting news. But the part that's new is relatively good, is kind of good news. So as a CBO director, I'm not always used to delivering good news. So we'll see if I can do it quickly. So the familiar part is the daunting fiscal trajectory. The fiscal situation, as Greg said, is unsustainable. In the near term, the challenge we face is rising interest payments. If you go to the CBO website on the front page, we have a one-pager with fiscal numbers. You can see that interest payments are rising, both because interest rates are higher than they've been in the past, and because we have more debt. So that's a challenge in its own right. It crowds out any other fiscal priority. Whatever a policymaker might want to do, well, they've got to pay those interest payments. So that's a problem. And then, of course, it makes us more vulnerable. So that's familiar. The longer term challenge is entitlements, is the mandatory spending. Social Security and Medicare are the two biggest pieces. So that's familiar. The somewhat new last year is first the legislation. So there's the Fiscal Responsibility Act of 2023, and then the continuing resolutions that effectively implemented it. So those actually bent the fiscal curve down by slightly more than $2 trillion over 10 years. So slightly more than the market cap of NVIDIA. Just to say, well, how daunting is the problem? Well, if NVIDIA turned itself over to the Treasury, that would make a modest change in the fiscal trajectory, but not a long one. I don't expect it. But it was good news, right? So we're not used to good news. That's one. And then number two is and so it's a complex picture, and that's immigration. Now, of course, immigration has lots of effects. There's social effects. There's security effects, and there's the fiscal burden on state and local governments. So there's lots of things to talk about. From the federal budgetary perspective, there are costs, and there's also revenues. The revenues are quite large, right? We have the labor force at the end of our 10-year budget window more than 5 million higher than we thought a year ago, basically because we've looked at DHS data on the number of people being released into the interior of the country. And that suggests that the labor force is just much larger than we thought. That has implications for the macroeconomy and for revenues. And so that's also the good fiscal news, but obviously with lots of complexity. Honest.
Terrific, thanks. Maya?
Good, thank you. It's so nice to be with you all. I am going to take Phil's good news steering wheel and just wrench it away from him. Enough of that. And I'm going to make 3 points, and they are, I'm really worried, I'm really worried, and I'm really worried. So quickly on each of those, the first is what the fiscal numbers, other than all of Phil's points, which are absolutely correct, and I love more than anything reading CBO documents, and the stuff on the immigration is really interesting. But the numbers are terrible. They are terrible. In 4 years, the debt to GDP is going to be the highest it's ever been in this country, surpassing where we were just after World War II, when we had obviously just completed fighting a world war. Debt's growing faster than the economy. Our deficits are going to be as a share of GDP at record levels for peacetime. Never seen them that high when we weren't in an emergency. And interest payments this year are going to be higher than we spend on national defense. They are going to be the second largest line item in the budget. Already, they were more than we were spending on all investment at the federal level on children. So there basically isn't a good metric out there on where we are on the fiscal situation looking forward. The second reason I'm really worried is there's always been one of the things about doing this that's so challenging is getting people to actually care about the issue because it doesn't connect to them directly. So there have always been the traditional reasons why one should care about deficits and debts. The truth is many people do not, but you should because of all the macroeconomic issues. It can crowd out investment that slows growth, the standard of living. It leads to interest payments that are growing faster than other parts of the budget. Right now they are the fastest growing part in the budget. And you may not be prepared when the next emergency comes along, and you do have to borrow, because there are many times we do have to borrow and we should borrow. The US is always lucky. We're able to borrow when the economy goes into crisis without problem. That will not last if we continue to use our fiscal space. But I now feel like there's so many other new reasons to worry, and maybe this is because I think I just worry professionally. I think that's what I'm drawn to. But if I look at the fiscal situation, it basically is what you need is a sound underpinning for all the other things you have to tackle. And if you look at our environment right now, on top of the bad fiscal situation, we have a terrible geopolitical situation, much more dangerous than we had understood, and that is going to require more spending in the area of national security, probably. And part of our own national security is not being dependent on other countries for borrowing, or vulnerable because we've borrowed so much we can't do the things we need to. There's going to be, I'm coming from the dark, dreary coast over to, weather aside, the optimistic, innovative coast. But even I can look at all the incredible things that are happening in technology and all the amazing innovation. But so much of it is also going to be incredibly important that it's all used for the good purposes, not the dangerous purposes. And part of what the US government is going to have to do is protect against the dangerous purposes. And that means probably investing in a number of these areas on its own. We're going to need to make large public investments. Our social contract is on the verge of just falling apart, right? Both Social Security and Medicare Part A will be insolvent in roughly a decade. We have done nothing for decades. My master's thesis was on how to fix Social Security. We've done nothing. And the point is that this is actually a social insurance program that was made for the risks of last century. It completely misses all the risks of this century. Disruption, geographical change, problems during your working years of becoming irrelevant, not just retirement and healthcare. And so there are many new reasons that we're going to have to be prepared fiscally to respond to the different threats that are out there, and we could have been. And then just finally, my third reason I'm worried is we know how to fix it. We totally know how to fix it. Mark came to an incredible conference we had this summer and presented a Social Security plan, which it's the answer. He laid out, here's how you fix Social Security. The problem is it's not that we don't know how to do the policy. Our politics are beyond broken. And if you look at polarization versus the things you need to do to have a fiscal deal, to do good fiscal policy, you need to focus on good policy, not good politics, because it's terrible politics. It's raising taxes, cutting spending, and reforming entitlements. Everything that everyone running for president is going to promise not to do. That's what we have to do. So you need to do good policy. You need to focus on the long term, because if you have a fiscal consolidation plan, you will have contraction for a couple of years, but you will then have higher growth over time. You need to focus on compromise, which used to be a no-brainer, but it's become a bad word in Washington. And you need to acknowledge that they're hard choices. And right now we have theories, I call them the tooth fairy theories of just pretend things why you don't have to make any hard choices. And it's just not true. So we've lost the political leadership talking about what's going to have to get done. So those are my three why I'm worried.
Thanks.
All right, thanks. I got my doctorate here, and it's always good to be back on the farm. And because I did get educated here, if I say anything wrong, you can blame the faculty rather than me. I'm going to basically agree with Phil on the economics and agree with Maya on the politics. And let me actually take the politics first. Yeah, there's a lot of polarization, no question, and that gets in the way of everything. But the fiscal problem is it goes way beyond polarization. Even if there were no polarization, it would still be very difficult to solve for 4 reasons. First, the Founding Fathers created a government where it's difficult to do big things. If you compare the US state to the UK, the new government comes into the UK and says, we're doing this. And I kind of laugh because in the US, the US government, new government says that, and then someone in Capitol Hill says this is dead on arrival, right? You need the House, the Senate, you need the committees, you need the whole governing body, you need the White House to sign. It's very difficult to do big things in the US government. When the economy is going along fine, that's a good thing. When the economy needs government intervention, that's a bad thing. But that's point 1. Point 2, the fiscal solutions are sort of classic public choice issues. The costs of a fiscal solution are very obvious and are concentrated among the people whose taxes go up or whose benefits go down. And you can see that your taxes go up or your benefits go down. In contrast, the benefits of a fiscal solution are very widely spread out and they're hard to attribute. So like if there's an earthquake and it reduces a building to rubble, you can walk by and say that earthquake caused that building to collapse, right? But if you walk by an empty lot, it's not the first thing you think of to say, gee, the government's borrowing a lot of money and that's crowding out investors and therefore nobody built on that lot. But that's the nature of the costs. They're very hard to attribute directly to fiscal policy, but we know they're out there. And so in public choice, when you have concentrated and obvious costs against diffuse and hard to attribute benefits, you can imagine how the politics go. The people who face the cost lobby very hard against it and typically win. Okay, another problem on the political side is there's no deadline. All right, we'll probably talk more about what it will cause, what we will need to get to a solution, but there's no real deadline for them to doing things, and given that it's painful, they're not going to do it. The last political problem, I'll just add it, is even if they came to a solution, even if they sat down in a room and came to a solution, there's one more hurdle, which is they have to figure out how the changes they agree to actually get implemented in the future. And they need assurances that they don't get undone. For example, Republicans oppose tax increases for many reasons, but one of them is they think that if they raise revenues, Democrats are just going to raise spending. Democrats oppose spending cuts for many reasons, but one of the reasons is in the past when they've cut spending, Republicans have come back and used that as a reason for tax cuts. So there has to be a way to ensure that the things they agree on get implemented. And that's a very difficult thing, and I'm glad we have Phil and Maya here because they're going to explain the answer to that question since I can't. On the economic side, let me just say this is not a crisis. It's a problem, no question, but we have time. We have time to deal with it. And I'll say more in that, but let me stop there.
Sure. Thanks. Let me actually, the first thing I want to talk about is where you ended, Bill, which is on the contributions to a crisis. So in some ways, the 10 years before the pandemic, the secular stagnation period gave us a reprieve because interest rates were extremely low. So that made the burden of carrying the debt, quite acceptable. And Olivier Blanchard, an economist that many of you probably know, some years ago, at his presidential address to the American Economic Association, introduced us to the concept of R minus G. R is the interest rate, G is the growth rate. If you subtract the growth rate from the real interest rate, then as long as that number is negative, you actually have a lot of breathing room. The debt basically, the debt tends towards sustainability on its own. And at the time, the interest rate was about 2 or 3 percentage points below the growth rate. So that gave us lots of cushion. In fact, Olivier showed that historically, it was more likely to be negative than positive. Today, it's a little bit different. Interest rates have gone up a little bit. So my question, I'll start with you, Phil, is how has the change in interest rates, especially real rates, between now versus, say, 5 years ago, altered the fiscal trajectory?
Yeah, I mean, it's both. It's the interest rate and it's what's going on with the deficit, that in both of those together are feeding into the debt. So, as Greg said, we have higher interest rates, and that's contributing to wider deficits in itself, and then feeding back into debt. I mean, in some sense, what Bill said about this is not a crisis right now, I also agree with that. This is like it's like an old Saab, if everyone's driven that, like the turbo lag in an old Saab. So we're in we've stepped on the accelerator, but we're waiting for the turbocharger to kick in. And that's the problem, is that the higher interest rates, it speeds that up.
Maya?
Yeah, I think I would quibble with the fact that it was so great that we did have those low interest rates in that way, that it really was a permission slip to borrow more. And people, for political reasons, took it as such. And both of them know I criticized this article massively, but Larry Summers and Jason Furman wrote, I think, the worst foreign affairs article I've read on why low interest rates meant that you could borrow. And they gave all these reasons that you could borrow. And then in the end, it said, actually, what you should do is you should put the debt on a downward path relative to GDP, but that's too nuanced. And so we just go for simple. And I was like, foreign affairs readers can handle nuance, right? You could actually write the article about what you should do. But as a result, we borrowed so much during that period that our debt is so much higher now that when interest rates go up, it's like a credit card teaser rate. Basically, we're much more vulnerable. And so if rates go up 1 percentage point above what we're anticipating they will, your borrowing costs increase by almost $300 billion a year. And so this is a huge shift because of the amount of debt that we have. The other thing about Olivier's paper and R versus G, one of the pieces of it that went somewhat unnoticed was it really works if you're basically running a close to primary balance. And however, at the point, we were not, but more importantly, our problem isn't just how high our debt is, it's how much of the structural borrowing is built into our budget. And so I think the number was at the time when the paper came out, we were projected to borrow another $14 trillion over the decade, which meant that doesn't work. So R versus G doesn't apply unless you're at a structurally balanced place, which we were not. So again, another sort of reason of don't worry, be happy, we can borrow. And there are many, many people, for the political reasons, whenever their party's in office, they would rather find reasons to borrow, because fiscal responsibility is really like political defense. It's like true religion for my staff, but for most people, it's kind of in Washington, it's political defense. Like if the other guys are in power, suddenly we found fiscal responsibility so we can keep them from implementing their agenda.
Blanchard wrote an article in November where he didn't quite recant, but he said that market rates, the market is expecting rates to go higher, and if the market is right, we have a problem. And so, I mean, I think we had this incredible period of low interest rates, which was a combination of the global saving glut and then the flight to safety after the 2008 recession. But that period is slowing down at least, and it's not going to buy us out of, 8 years ago, 7 years ago, we might have thought, oh, well, these interest rates are so low, we have a lot of time, we have a lot of maneuverability. But that's being used up rapidly, and it has an implication for our Mark's interview with Adriana Kugler later today, because the Fed usually thinks about interest rates in terms of how the economy's doing, but increasingly, because the debt is so high, interest rates are having impact on the budget. So that just makes the Fed's problem more complicated.
In fact, do you think that the high level of the debt right now might be contributing to higher interest rates?
Contributing to
where interest rates are today?
Sure. I mean, it's not the only, there's this long-standing debate about whether debt and deficits affect interest rates, and clearly interest rates move around for other reasons, right? But there's sort of this solid underbase. There's a kind of stylized fact out there that an increase in the debt to GDP ratio of 1% raises interest rates by 2 to 4 basis points. So if you look at 2008, when the debt to GDP ratio was 39, and now it's 98, right? You're talking about 120 to 240 basis points kind of built in. That's not going to explain the day-to-day fluctuations in interest rates, but it's a constant pressure on demand, on supply.
Well, Bill, let me stick with you for a moment, though, because I think you said that we're not at an economic crisis moment yet. And as I said, in my 30 years in this business, that crisis always seemed to be around the corner. It never came. Reinhard Rogoff said that 90% debt to GDP ratio was an important threshold, but it came and went. Nothing happened. People said, well, look at, what about 200%? Japan's at 200%. And actually, real rates this year are more negative than they were last year. So my question to you is, at what point, in fact, last night's question came up at dinner time, and I get it all the time. At what point does it become a crisis? Is there a tipping point, and how will we know?
Okay, we don't know. If you had asked, if you had asked any of us in 2008, when the debt to GDP ratio was 39%, what would happen if the debt to GDP ratio were 100%? We would have told you some pretty bad tales of woe that would make Maya look like an optimist. But it hasn't happened. I mean, we don't know what that D star is, and of course we don't really want to find out. But it's certainly, debt markets have proven much more resilient than I think people thought, at least that I thought 10, 15 years ago.
To me, it feels like a bubble, like lots of bubbles feel, where you're like, that this can't go on forever. I mean, first off, there's absolutely no certain point. We have no idea. The crisis, there's two kinds of crises. There's an outward obvious crisis of a debt spiral, and then there's a crisis of lost opportunities, which I think we're already in the midst of. But the real issue is, when do people lose faith and stop wanting to buy our debt? But it feels very much like a bubble to me, where you kind of know you're on shaky ground. It's unsustainable. None of the fundamentals justify it. But if it's going to stay this way for years and years, you don't want to miss out on the run-up of the bubble. So my guess is that along the way, and it depends on the stability of other countries too. There's so many jokes, right? But I'll steal my favorite, which is we're the best-looking horse in the glue factory. That's the U.S. economy. And it's going to depend when other places are doing better, and that's when we'll start to be in more trouble. But until then, I think the lost opportunities of what we're not doing with those interest payments, the money that's leaving the economy, the big ideas we're unable to even talk about. I think that it's not a crisis, but there's huge loss, there's huge damage that has already gone on, but you can never link them as closely to make people really see that linkage.
Can I just say one thing, Maya? We may have once been the best looking horse in the glue factory, but honestly, I think we've let ourselves go lately. If you look at the latest IMF numbers, the United States has the worst deficit numbers in the next 20 years. Anyway, just wanted to put that out there. Phil?
No, I was just going to add, I mean, I agree with everything they've said, and maybe I'll just add a little bit that my sense is that the situation is pretty well understood. And I mean, there was sort of the movement over the last couple of years, which has been, I'd say, thoroughly discredited about, sort of spending without limit and things like that. The question is, what will it take to make an adjustment? And just like Bill and Maya said, I can't tell you when. So like if, probably looking at everyone here, you probably have lots of kids, lots of parents of children in college, right? If they know the homework is due at 5 o'clock tomorrow, do they turn it in at 4:59, or do they turn it in a couple hours early? And so I don't know. Like I can't tell policymakers, here's the deadline, but I can tell you, like they said, the longer you wait, the more difficult the assignment gets, and the more unpleasant it gets. I don't know what it's going to take to get us as a nation to address it early. Obviously, it's some combination of leadership and politics and other things.
Also, can I just add that often you will hear, like, nothing bad has happened yet, so we're okay. So all these warnings were misplaced. But the story's not over. We're still in the middle of it, and we've been accumulating debt the whole time. And so the question is, what it looks like when the music stops. And my guess is it will be much worse than it would have been if we'd addressed this much earlier on.
So it's often been pointed out that a country like the United States that issues its own currency can't literally default because it can always, raise the taxes or if necessary print the money needed to repay it. I started my career in Canada, which is also a fiat currency issuer and it also has full sovereign control over its debt. Yet my early years were associated with what was a de facto debt crisis because what was happening was that we had an inflation problem. Interest rates went up. That made the budget worse. That made the deficit worse, the debt issuance worse. Interest rates went up further. The currency fell further. It was, for all intents and purposes, a crisis because there was this toxic interaction between fiscal and monetary policy and inflation. And so one of the questions I have for you is, another thing that's different about today versus say 5, 10, 15 years ago is we have an inflation problem. Now it's not as bad as it was or we thought it was a year ago, but inflation is above the Fed's target, it's not below, and it's very much on the minds of monetary policymakers, as I expect we'll hear from Governor Adriana Kugler later today. To what extent do you think that the fiscal situation today poses extant risks to inflation that could then become more of a dangerous interaction?
Do you want to?
Bill?
I'll give you a start. If I remember my Canadian economic history correctly, the party that implemented that plan got voted out massively in the next election, which is part of the political difficulty. People don't want to hear the message. I think inflation is a mixed bag. It actually is good for, it's good. The U.S. is a net borrower, so inflation, and it borrows mainly in nominal terms. So inflation is good, right? It degrades the real value of the debt. There are other aspects of the budget. It increases interest rates, but it also increases the nominal GDP rate. But we can't inflate our way out of this situation. That should be clear. Inflation, some Latin American countries maybe have tried, but inflation works as a long-term solution for the budget when your obligations are long-term and nominal in nature. All right, our financial obligations are short term. Something like $9 trillion in treasuries have to turn over in the next year. So our financial obligations are short term, but our long-term obligations are effectively indexed for inflation. They're Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. So you can't inflate your way out of a Social Security problem because the benefits are indexed. So it's really tempting in the short run to use inflation to reduce the debt to GDP ratio, but it's not going to get us where we want to get to ultimately.
So I do not think inflation is a good thing, and I do think that they are linked. And I think that this round of inflation had three causes, but the first of them was spending too much, borrowing too much, the American Rescue Plan, and then that was made much, much worse by supply chain issues and oil. And so I think clearly that too much borrowing can contribute to inflation. But to Bill's point, inflation is a good thing if you can have just a little bit of it and then stop it immediately. But inflation gets anchored, which it did here. It lasts longer, and because your debt is turning over, and I think like 1/3 of our debt is under a year, and roughly 2/3 is under 5. It's very short-term oriented. Because we have to continue to finance that debt with more debt, it pushes upward pressure on our interest payments. So debt to GDP went down initially with inflation, but that's not going to last. It didn't last. It's not going to last when you have to keep turning your debt over like we do.
Phil, do you want to?
Yeah, I'll just say quickly that the analysis we've done is in some sense quantifying some of the points they've made, that what's the effect of inflation on the US budget trajectory, and as Bill and Maya said, the spending side and the revenue side basically cancel out. And so the lasting impact of inflation on the fiscal trajectory is the impact on interest rates, right? Higher inflation over time will lead to higher interest rates, and then that's what kicks in. That's my bad Saab reference. Yeah, so inflation is, as Bill said, it might be a short-term benefit, but over the long term, it's quite the opposite.
Okay. So I want to touch on a point. You've both brought up the entitlements issue here, but in your opening remarks, Phil, both you and Maya expressed some optimism, or at least positive remarks. Maya probably doesn't want to be associated with the word optimism in any circumstance. About the Fiscal Responsibility Act, which I think was struck a year ago, which set basically some caps on the level of certain types of spending for several years. And I think, Phil, one of you said it was $2 trillion over a decade.
2.3 trillion over 10 years.
But correct me if I'm wrong, that was all entirely on the discretionary side of the budget, right? And it feels to me, at least in my time covering this, that every so-called debt consolidation deal always deals with the discretionary side. Is that, in fact, a pathway to a solution, a pathway to sustainability?
No, maybe I'll start. As you said, the FRA focused on discretionary spending, and the long-term problem is on the mandatory side. Right? Social Security, Medicare, and other mandatory spending programs. So the FRA was meaningful, it was big enough to matter, but it addressed a sort of modest part of the long-term problem. And I don't know how to answer the question about how do you translate that. Right? Did the FRA lead to momentum tackling entitlements? No, I think clearly not. What's needed to get there on the entitlement side? I don't know. It sure doesn't look like it's going to happen this year. Looking at the presidential campaign, that doesn't seem to be a focus of here's my reform.
Yeah, the Fiscal Responsibility Act was incredibly productive in some ways. Last year was the first year in many where we actually overall, if you look at legislation, executive orders, did more that reduced the debt by 1.3 trillion over 10 years. That's net, everything together, compared to all the past years. We have something that tracks this every year called the debt thermometer. If anybody wants to track how we're doing each year, you can sort of look at it. That said, the FRA hasn't actually gone into effect yet, right? We're on our 4th CR, and they still can't figure out what the budget's going to be. We're 5 months into the fiscal year, and our budget's not there. But to the obvious point, yeah, this was only this tiny sliver, this half of discretionary spending, domestic discretionary, where they were able to generate savings. We have to fix Social Security. We have to fix Medicare and healthcare. We're going to have to raise revenues. Everybody who is saying that none of those things or all of those things aren't going to happen, it's just continuing to perpetuate absolute fiscal myths. And you've got Republicans saying you can't raise taxes, and you have Democrats saying you can't raise taxes on 98% of people. And that's not going to work either. It's going to have to actually be middle-class tax cuts when you come to the increases, when you come to look at the whole size of structurally how bad we are. So the sooner we can figure that out, the better. The last thing I would just say is we blew it with entitlements. If we had made these changes, because you're never going to hit current seniors, you need to phase them in gradually. If we had done it before the baby boomers were retiring, so many people could have been a little bit of the solution, and now it's going to be so much more fall on younger people who are facing a lot of challenges if you look at both the fiscal situation, the economic situation, and the global situation. So time was of the essence, and that was a window that really shut for us to have done it well.
Bill.
Thanks. Just 2 points. One is, Maya's right, it's the imbalance between spending and taxes that's causing the problem. Spending is going up, particularly on entitlements, but those are not new initiatives being created. That's just the operation of the program that was put in place many years ago. So it's not like the government is becoming more expansive. It's just because of demographics and the size of debt, you should expect spending to rise. Whether you want them to cut spending or raise taxes to make the difference, or obviously some combination, is a separate question. The other thing I'll note on the spending side is, Greg, you're exactly right. The deal only targets a small part of the budget. When you think about cutting spending, there's a kind of a key fact to keep in mind. In a typical year, 3/4 of federal spending is either net interest, defense, Social Security, or healthcare. And for various reasons, all of those seem to be untouchable in particular situations. And that's why you get proposals to eliminate the Department of Commerce or to eliminate Department of Education. There's basically nothing left in the budget. And so if you want to make big spending cuts, you can't go after net interest. That's what we're trying to avoid. Defense, as Maya mentioned, may actually need to go up. The Social Security is kind of a sacred cow. And the one result that I believe in all the polling I've seen on deficits is that people would rather raise taxes than cut benefits for Social Security. And that kind of leaves healthcare as the big section out there that might be ripe for cuts. So anyway, that's how I think about the spending situation.
So none of us here are politicians or even political consultants, so naturally I'm going to ask you a political question. On Tuesday, here in the great state of California, they'll be going to the polls to, for the primary election. I think Donald Trump is probably going to win in this and a variety of other states, and that may get him very close to locking up the nomination. And that may have consequences for the issues that we're talking about, because, I mean, for the longest time, you could predictably say the Democrats were for raising taxes but not cutting spending, and Republicans were for cutting spending but not raising taxes. And Trump, in some sense, completely altered that orthodoxy, and the Republican side said, we will not touch Medicare, we will not touch Social Security. His last budget director, Russell Vought, recently wrote a budget for Trump that purports to get deficit back to sustainability, only cutting discretionary and completely leaving Medicare and Social Security alone. And now you are seeing a growing part of the Republican caucus sort of like echoing that. Which of you wants to comment on the significance of this shift in the sort of like the base sort of like viewpoint of the Republican Party on fiscal matters?
Maybe I can.
Oh, you're going to.
Yeah, I'll start. I'm going to start because CEPR is nonpartisan, and is one of the key aspects of the agency is the nonpartisanship, and it's from the very beginning. Every 2 years, we put out a volume of what we call budget options, and so there's ways to reduce the budget deficit. It's sort of the fiscal equivalent of the Cheesecake Factory menu, if you think of that. And for some people, it's, well, this is a pay for, so they're interested in, I'm going to reduce the deficit so I can spend it on something else. That's there for you. 2 years ago, we put out a volume that focused on big things. It was actually Keith Hennessy, who's here at the business school. It was his phrase was add a zero, that we needed to add a zero and think bigger. And so we did. And we came up with 17 items, basically 17 policies that would each save at least $500 billion over 10 years. And, some more, some less. And it was everything, defense spending, it was higher taxes, everything. And none of those things are palatable. I mean, they're all, I can't think of any single one that's palatable. I'll tell you one of them, so this is a long wind-up, one of them. So I've told you, we've done all these things, CBO doesn't endorse any of them. I'll talk about one of them, which is on Social Security. And that said, it actually had a flavor of policy proposals that are out there. It said we're going to raise benefits very substantially at the bottom, right? People with low lifetime earnings get low lifetime benefits in dollars. They also live less, live shorter lives, so that hurts them as well. So raise benefits very, very substantially at the bottom and flatten out benefits. So, my guess is that no one in this room is going to be retiring on Social Security, or at least no one seated. So, I'm sure none of you would like it, but none of us say would like it, but we're not going to be retiring on it. So that's the policy. Depending on the parameters, obviously you can do it different ways, that can make Social Security solvent forever, right? Not just for 75 years, but forever. That solves about 20% of the fiscal problem by itself. So that, I don't know the politics of that. Obviously, it's not happening. But you can imagine solutions like that sort of seem like they have a flavor of things for everyone. They're out there. We're not endorsing anything, but they're out there to be had.
So there were several key words in there, Phil, particularly the obviously it's not happening part.
I will just say, I hate politics. I hate politics, and it's a problem because I'm a native Washingtonian, and I still live in Washington, and I have a skill set that doesn't work anywhere other than Washington. So I'm kind of stuck with it. But I'm a diehard political independent, and I don't think entities where you create the group of people who run the entity, divide them into two teams, and tell them to kill each other while running the entity, I don't think it works. And I think that's what we're seeing all the time. When it comes to this issue, I think what happened was Republicans with Donald Trump's leadership realized, promising that the other side is going to slash, and I'm so tired of reading the word slash when you're talking about tiny incremental changes and things, but slash benefits. And so they've adopted that for themselves. Many, many Republicans on Capitol Hill who I worked with spent the past year saying, we really sold out. We know we have to fix these entitlements. We're going to start talking about it again. They have stopped, so that ended. But I think you left at the other side, which is Democrats also learned from Republicans that promising not to raise taxes, except on millionaires and billionaires, works too, right? It really is only 2% they're talking about. So everybody's just taking the worst page from each other's playbook because it works. And if we don't figure out some way to have like a fiscal ceasefire where they start to be realistic, this just continues.
Bill?
It's always hard to follow Maya on these topics. You can criticize Trump on a lot of things, and I have. Coming to the argument that he wants to preserve Social Security benefits doesn't strike me as one of the top 100 things I'm worried about with respect to him. It's more of there's a general phenomenon that a colleague of mine told me, I think it was Hank Aaron, who is here and is on the SIEPR board, but he told me that distance is a policy's best friend. And what he meant was, like, people can say, all right, we're going to tighten our belts and cut spending. Yeah. And then they say, oh, where are we actually going to do this? And they start looking and it doesn't look so good. And they say, oh, and I think that's kind of what's going on. Like, oh, we need to cut spending, we need to cut Social Security, and then they look at it closely and say, wow, maybe we don't want to do this for political reasons.
So one of the popular solutions often to problems that neither party wants to touch is you create a commission. Oh, by the way, before I say this, I wanted to say, call out something that Mark Dugan, our friend here, he wrote a terrific paper, Maya already referenced it, for a different organization I'm affiliated with, the Aspen Economic Strategy Group. And if you are interested in Social Security, I strongly recommend it. Just Google it, because it is one of the most thorough, comprehensive, thoughtful reform plans on Social Security. It basically spreads the pain around to a lot of people. And if people were not so embedded in the politics of this, I think it's something that actually get traction. So, Mark, just wanted to share that with your. Yeah, it is. It really is. I finished it in one sitting. Anyway, what I wanted to turn to next was when the parties can't agree to do the pain on their own, they often basically punt by asking a committee or a commission. So Simpson-Bowles was the last example. Maya, I know this is something that you've advocated for. Could a commission help fix this problem, and how would it work in a way that hasn't worked in the past, because it hasn't worked in the past?
So we, a couple years ago, built a bipartisan group on Capitol Hill called the Bipartisan Fiscal Forum. And it's a group of people that are sort of dipping their toe in the water of bold, courageous things. Like, they're not going to take your Social Security plan and run with it anytime soon. But they've called for a fiscal state of the nation, where once a year somebody would come and talk about how bad the fiscal situation is. And it's sort of trying to think about baby steps, how to help these folks who are working in a bipartisan way to really push important ideas out there. And so we were talking about things. And clearly, one of the ones that has the most support is a fiscal commission, because those on Capitol Hill, the lawmakers understand, many of them do understand what has to get done. They can't possibly do it on their own. Even if they were willing to, it's not going to have enough support for them for it to actually get done. Then they're just going to lose their seat. So that's not helpful. So I think there are a number of advantages of a fiscal commission. One, the folks running the country, not across the board, but many of them aren't as well versed on these topics as they used to be. As in, they really don't understand this stuff. It's pretty scary. And so one of the great things about a fiscal commission is a chance for people to dig down much deeper. Because I think people used to have political talking points and they knew they were just talking points. I think a lot of members of Congress believe the talking points now. And so the chance to really understand the issues, the challenges, and that you can't do this, just from whatever, waste, fraud, and abuse, whatever the things are, and become familiar is really important. I think number two, actually understanding each other's values, why there are different points of view. On Simpson-Bowles, one of the most interesting things was watching Tom Coburn, incredibly conservative, Dick Durbin, incredibly liberal, really start to understand each other and the values that they came with. And it was like, oh, Dick Durbin did decide that you could make changes to Social Security as long as you protected the bottom 40%. That mattered to him. And Tom Coburn decided, okay, you could raise revenues as long as you were willing to do the ones that were most pro-growth. So they really made progress. I think it's much more poisonous now than it was, but you can see that can happen. And you can also use it as an opportunity to create better understanding across the country. Because right now, people just have politicians telling them they can have it all and not pay for anything. So you need a public education campaign. Finally, the political cover. You get a commission recommendation, if you do, and then you can say, well, we had to do something, I voted for it, but trust me, if I had been on the commission, it would have been much better, or I would have done much better on my own. So I think a fiscal commission is really, really important. I think it's the only thing that has a shot of working right now. And back to my starting 3 points, I think it's probably unlikely to work, but there may be a crisis. There may be a huge moment, and so if you have something that's in the works, that's ready to go, that can help a lot too. So I think it's actually quite important we get a fiscal commission done, and then there'll be a lot of work. That's the easy part, is getting it in place. There'll be a lot of work in the next year, getting it to actually come up with real recommendations that aren't used as political attack ads, but instead can be implemented.
Phil, I saw you nodding along. Do you agree with what Maya said? Phil, sorry.
Oh, me? No, I was just thinking that what I mean, I don't have a view on legislation, so I can't answer yes. But just putting everything on the table, right? I was just thinking, like, I gather that's the kind of issue Stanford's been having. Like, if you say the wrong thing, people shout at you and do stuff, and just making it kind of okay to put everything on the table in the way that Maya said. That seems really useful.
So I'm in favor, very much in favor of a commission. It may not work, but nothing else is going to work, so let's give it a shot. But it's not without risks. Democrats worry that commissions are stalking horses for cutting Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. Republicans worry that commissions are stalking horses for raising taxes, right? And besides White House cover, the White House is the only nationally elected office. The White House has to say everyone's going to lose a little bit of what they want, but the overall outcome is going to be better. You have to go with the flow. Besides White House cover, we also need this notion that everything's on the table. That has an important implication, because a lot of Republicans have signed something called the No New Taxes Pledge. and a lot of Democrats have signed a letter that said they've never cut Social Security. So in my view, if everything's on the table, those people should either not be eligible for the commission, or they should have to renege on their previous signature. All right, so that's one thing I think that would help the commission if the members were seriously interested in everything on the table. And the other thing, and this is my own thing, this would never happen in Washington, but I'm not in Washington, so I can say it. Normally the way the commissions work is the Republicans pick the Republicans and the Democrats pick the Democrats. I would like to see a commission where the Republicans pick the Democrats and the Democrats pick the Republicans. Because each side knows who they can talk to, who they can work with. And if the Republicans pick the Republicans, the Democrats pick the Democrats, they're going to pick a distribution of the party. You're going to get those, you understand. And not all elements of the parties want to compromise. But if you can get that middle, the commission has to be a middle out kind of thing. If you can get the people in the middle talking to each other, you have some chance of success.
Thanks. I think we have about 15 minutes left. We can take some questions.
So, given how much political opposition there would be to raising income taxes, has there been any thought recently again about doing a wholesale change to our tax regimen? For example, some kind of replacement of income tax with a non-regressive VAT, which actually would raise income in a way that, potentially both parties could get behind.
I did not plant that question in the audience. Yes, the U.S. is the only country in the world without a value-added tax, except for Greenland, I think. But literally every other advanced country has a value-added tax. A value-added tax has a huge advantage. It does not discourage saving or investment. It does not discourage or encourage exports or imports. There's a famous story of the bank robber Willie Sutton in the 1930s asked why he robbed banks. And he said, because that's where the money is. And okay, VATs are where the money is in tax reform. In Europe, they're the third largest revenue behind the income tax and payroll tax. They raise much more than corporate taxes. A 10% value-added tax in the U.S. would raise, I think, about 3% of GDP, depending on whether you use some of the money to offset the burden on low-income households. It would have no distortion to saving investment, and I've been pushing this for a while, so thank you for asking.
Larry Summers once said that we don't have a VAT because Democrats think it's regressive and Republicans think it's a vast revenue raiser. We would get a VAT when those switch sides.
They realize.
Yeah.
But I think in the tax discussions I'm having, where you kind of give yourself the freedom to have big ideas, there are three big ideas that float around a lot. One of them is certainly a form of consumption tax and a progressive consumption tax. There's many ways to structure it. I've always loved this Bradford X tax, but where you have progressive rates on how much you spend. But the second area is a carbon tax. You hear a lot about a carbon tax, probably with a dividend or a rebate. And the third is the amount of tax expenditures or tax breaks we have in the tax code are well over $1.5 trillion in lost revenue a year. I mean, it's incredible. And Simpson Bowles had a very clever idea which said, imagine you get rid of all tax breaks. Your tax rates could go down so low, and I forget what it was, but 12, 14, 18, something. And then you can't really get rid of all of them, but you have to buy them back. So you want the home mortgage interest deduction, but maybe a little bit lower, and so that would cost another rate. And you want to keep charitable, so that would be another rate up. But it would actually create a budget on these huge tax expenditures, which are notoriously inefficient, regressive, pay us to do things we would do anyhow, don't receive any kind of scrutiny like spending programs. So that's another area of the budget that we could make a lot of changes, get new revenue, probably ways that wouldn't be necessarily damaging to the economy.
Okay.
Yeah, we've had a question over there.
Thanks. It seems like these fiscal panels always sort of operate somewhat independently of another big part of the government, which is monetary policy. And a lot of the things that you mentioned kind of rhyme with fiscal dominance. Talking about Canada a couple years ago in the UK. And the Fed is not neutral anymore because they have $8 trillion on their balance sheet. And so the impacts of the budget and interest rates that R minus G that you spoke about, they're kind of intertwined in a way. How do organizations think about modeling potentially a transition from monetary dominance, which we've seen kind of Greenspan, Bernanke, the Fed has been the be-all and end-all, to potentially an environment kind of, which lots of other countries have had more recently, and the U.S. has had in the past, of kind of fiscal dominance. How do you think about incorporating that into your forecast or your outlook?
So the story about Jackson Hole.
Go ahead. Yeah.
So Greg and I were both at the Fed's Jackson Hole meeting in 2008. I was then the Assistant Secretary for Economic Policy at the Treasury, and it was the first time I'd been there. I think now the person in my position is routinely invited, but it was the first time. And I'm pretty sure it was Greg who came up to me and said, "What are you doing here? You're the fiscal guy at a monetary policy conference." And my answer was something like, "Fiscal, monetary, what's the difference these days?" Since the Fed was, during the financial crisis, the Fed did lots of things that really tread right up to the line of fiscal policy. In a crisis, people look to the Fed. The Fed can act. And in some sense, that's the long run danger is if we get to, the sort of whatever this point out there where there is a crisis, people are going to look to the Fed. And so it doesn't mean there's fiscal dominance today, but I think we're probably agreeing that we can see it out into the future that it's going to happen. And obviously that's happened in other countries. Argentina is a infamous example, and it doesn't end well. On the other hand, I'm not expecting the Fed to come out and say, "Here is my fiscal plan," because that crosses the border of what the Fed should be doing.
Probably noteworthy though, and I think you presented at Jackson Hole, and I've gone a couple times, and I always feel like I have to go and say, I'm really sorry, the fiscal people are not doing their job and making your job much worse. But this past year, Barry Eichengreen had an excellent paper sort of going through all the possible ways you could address the debt and why they weren't going to work. And so I think it's worth noting that when one of the papers they bring is on fiscal policy, there's certainly an awareness of how we're making their job harder.
I think you raise a really important issue. We've kind of touched on it with the discussion of inflation and interest rates. But one thing that is not widely recognized is during COVID, when we had very expansive fiscal policy, the Fed bought up a very large share of the debt. And that was on top of the debt they already had. And so you're right, there's this unwinding that has to happen, which will put added pressure on interest rates when it does.
So Greg, and if I might just add, I think this question could become, very salient before long. Jay Powell, the current chairman, his term ends in 2026. Whoever's president at that time will have an opportunity to name his replacement. And if the person making that decision does not view independence of the Federal Reserve from the rest of the political fiscal apparatus the way traditionally presidents have, that will have important implications, I think, for exactly the question you've raised.
Okay, we've got a question over here. Fred? Yeah.
Thank you. A lot of insights and a common factor in your comments, which says crisis is, in some sense, the way the world gets resolved one way or another. It's the burning platform approach, but it comes like a thief in the night. You don't know when. The nature of the crisis is whatever it happens to be, it will impose risk on all financial instruments, at least in the storytelling that has occurred. Could you explore the place of safety in the world in the context of fiscal and monetary management in the U.S.?
Of what was the last fiscal and monetary?
Can you, in the context of fiscal and monetary management,
got it.
what is safe?
Okay.
Did you say the price of safety?
The points of safety.
The points of safety.
Okay. Maybe I can start for Ism. The third chapter of our recent budget and economic outlook goes through the changes. and we talked about the Fiscal Responsibility Act was a big one. There are tax credits for electric vehicles and things like that, which are more expensive than was originally estimated, and so on. It goes through what higher interest rates are contributing, and says, well, how much of it is the higher interest rates? How much of it is more debt? And it's like 2/3, 1/3 of the larger net interest payments. And the way I connected to the question is, well, what would happen if there's a credible plan to make some progress on fiscal adjustment? Well, I think we would, I suspect, well, certainly I'll speak for myself, I'd expect that to have an immediate impact on interest rates. Or in the other direction, if the Fed said, oh, forget it, we're not gonna get back to 2%, 2% target, we're gonna have some higher target, well, that would do the opposite. That would immediately raise interest rates. But this is a point of safety, as you put it, if I had it right, that a credible adjustment, it doesn't have to happen right away, but the markets have to see it as credible, would have the kind of first turn of a potential beneficial cycle.
I'll just add, I wouldn't count the U.S. out as the place of safety. I know that sounds contradictory if we have a fiscal crisis, but in 2008, we literally exported a financial crisis to the rest of the world. And at the risk of oversimplifying, the rest of the world sent us money because we were a safe place to invest. And we are a pretty strong economic entity, and we are the reserve currency. And in a way, what you're asking is kind of what the unstoppable force meets the immovable object. What happens? And if the U.S. is really in crisis, then we're in a world we've never seen. But in the sort of normal run-of-the-mill ups and downs, the U.S. is still the safe haven.
We are, and we were then. But to quote one of my co-chairs, Leon Panetta, he had always said, changes will happen, and they will either come from leadership or crisis. And I had always assumed it would be leadership, and I no longer think that. I think crisis is very likely. But the other issue I would just put on the table, and back to take the negative of your question, but I had always assumed it would be more of an economic crisis. I now think it will be more about our role in the world. I think if we don't get our act together politically so that we can make the necessary choices that we have to, we will fail to do the things that we need to in terms of investment, in terms of protection, in terms of interacting with other parts of the world and staying unified and united in the face of a lot of incredibly dangerous and emerging threats. I think we will fall behind in our ability to lead. And so what scares me is kind of the interplay between our fiscal weakness, our polarization, and the external threats that we are facing and that seem to be growing, and we are not rising to the occasion to meet them.
How about one more, Greg?
Sure, any more?
Yeah, Barnaby, right here. Barnaby. We need a.
Sure. What's wrong with Simpson-Bowles as a roadmap?
That's a good one.
Okay, I'll repeat the question. What's wrong with Simpson-Bowles as a roadmap?
Yeah.
Simpson-Bowles is a perfect roadmap. It would be excellent. What's wrong is that when it happened 10 years ago, it saved $4 trillion. It did so in very smart ways. Probably the only weakness is it didn't have enough savings in healthcare. About $400 billion. We could do a lot more. We have to do a lot more. But the problem is much, much worse than when Simpson-Bowles came out, and the political situation is much, much worse. So it wouldn't get us as far as we need to do. With $4 trillion in savings, in fact, to balance the budget, over 10 years, it would take $15 trillion in savings. The last time we saved that much was obviously never. Nothing close is going to happen. It would take about $8 trillion to stabilize the debt where it is, and I think that's a reasonable goal, and I still think it's politically very aggressive. $4 trillion would be a huge win. It would be incredible to do it, but it wouldn't get us where we need to go. I think it is the right starting point, so much so that I actually had Erskine Bowles come up to DC 2 weeks ago and meet with a huge bipartisan, a lot of members showed up, but we had a bipartisan meeting for him to talk about what the lessons of a commission were, what things work, what things you would do differently. And there's a lot of support. It's the right blueprint. Maybe you just rename it and just bring it back. We don't even really need a commission. You just bring it back out. So I think it just hit it perfectly. And the problem at the time because there was a lot of support in the House and the Senate, a lot in the Senate. It never got a vote. And a big problem was that leadership didn't support it because leadership found it more useful to keep some of these problems alive than to solve them. So I think knowing that, we would know how to address it better and differently this time.
Thanks. I think that's probably all the time we have.
Sorry,
So
yeah, I think we're pretty much out of time. Thank you so much.